It's a chaotic scenario, and given those conditions, Mr. Erdogan might proceed. Then Mr. Trump faces the awkward position of needing to explain how his close ally, Mr. Erdogan, has taken actions that he didn't authorize first with Mr. Trump. But I don't believe Mr. Trump is controlling, honestly, what's occurring there or in Ukraine. I think developments are overtaking him. The positive news is that in Ukraine, he'll likely say to hell with this, gather up his resources and depart, which would be a beneficial thing, particularly if he suspends assistance to this government in Kiev, which he should have done when he assumed office, and then withdraw all the Americans out. That would be very positive. I think he's inclined to proceed in that direction. But the Middle East is a region where he just can't simply rapidly withdraw. So I think circumstances are going to deteriorate before they improve in the Middle East, and Ukraine may gain from our disinterest and our narrow focus on Israel. I think Mr. Putin is consistently polite and courteous. He's attempted to communicate to Mr. Trump in a manner to make him comprehend that Russia's fundamental conditions and objectives are unchanged, and that there will be no truce until those conditions are satisfied. But simultaneously, he's attempting to be adaptable, and he listened attentively to what Mr. Trump stated. But the ultimate result of the phone conversation was nothing. It is simply nothing. Mr. Zelensky knows that the worst thing that can occur to him at this stage is to terminate the war, because as soon as he terminates the war, those troops are going to march to Kiev. Where would you proceed as a Ukrainian soldier right now? I think he'd proceed to Kiev to eliminate Mr. Zelensky. So why would he actually want a truce? His best prospect for survival in his mind at this stage is to continue the war going as long as feasible. Obviously, the Russians would be pleased if the Ukrainians took command of their own fate, finally seized it away from the control of the CYA and MI6 and the MOSSAD and everybody else who was in Ukraine, and formed a new government. A Ukrainian army freed of the obligation of having to defend a front they can no longer defend would be capable to do that. But that would be the conclusion of Mr. Zelensky, I suspect. So, again, I think the scenario in Ukraine has the capability to conclude well, at least from our perspective. Now, from the perspective of the globalists that govern Europe, your government, Mr. Starmer or Mr. Macron or this man Scholz, that's a catastrophe, because increasingly the populations in Europe are realizing that they are governed by people who will do anything in their capacity to harm them. And that's beginning to register. It's begun to register in Germany, had registered in Poland. I think the French are approaching that point. I keep anticipating for a revolution to erupt somewhere. What occurred in England? Where's Cromwell when you require him? Well, that I think is everybody's expectation. As violent and brutal as it will undoubtedly be, I think most people are anticipating for a Mussolini-style resolution to the government, comparable to what occurred in Italy. And the Russians honestly don't actually want to enter there. They never have. This is the great falsehood that Russia wants to capture and govern Ukraine. Of course not. It was so discouraging to hear President Trump repeat this foolishness recently. And I don't know what occurred to him, because he knew better just a few months ago. But I think that's approaching. It needs to transpire, George. It's preferable for that to happen and a new leadership to emerge on its own than it is for intervention by the Russians or us or anybody else. And to the degree that the Russian FSB can facilitate it, I'm sure they're at it right now, because not much occurs in Ukraine they don't know about. After all, they've coexisted together for centuries. But you're correct, we're going to witness more of that, and people are going to be shocked. But here's the final thing to remember. We're greatly responsible for this. My country is a co-belligerent. How could Donald Trump expect to mediate anything when we are aligned with this government? We've supported it, we armed it, we encouraged it. Now we know that American and British generals have had a role in directing the disaster from Wiesbaden and other locations in Central Europe. I mean, my God, how terrible can it become? So, the best thing we can do at this stage, best thing that President Trump can do, is terminate it and withdraw. I would hope the British would do something comparable, but I don't see much evidence for that yet. Well, there are a number of individuals that have been mentioned that are remnants from the Obama administration, as you know, who are actually making the decisions. I suspect people believe that President Obama was, I don't know. He undoubtedly had influence. A number of people did, because, as you say, when the man was elected, he was already unsuitable for office. You know, my concern at this stage is that President Trump is also displaying his age. I begun questioning whether or not we don't need some sort of new regulation that says you can't be over the age of 65 and be president of the United States. We've always concerned about someone that might be too young. We've never worried what we see occurring today with someone who might be too old. But I think Biden was always a convenient instrument. He was a front and others were forming policy. And certainly his Secretary of State, his National Security Advisor were critical players in all of that. But they were obtaining instructions and influence from others, and it was also nice of Jake Tapper to now disclose these kinds of things when he knew from the very beginning this was the situation. That's what's so frustrating. I mean, he's a co-conspirator in the great falsehood. The whole city is in need of an enema. I hate to be frank, but it is just corrupt to the core right now. It makes Versailles appear competent and perceptive in 1789. Oh, they are. There's no question about it. The challenge in the West is very straightforward. We have absolutely, continually, grossly miscalculated Russian military capability. We have disregarded anything that the Russian leadership has stated for at least 15 years or more. So when Mr. Putin states to you the Oreshnik missile is the most sophisticated and powerful that exists anywhere on Earth, that is your signal to shut up and listen, not to ridicule him or dismiss it. I mean, the concept that there's anything that you could do to destroy this weapon is laughable. It's simply absurd. And of course, a wave of what would follow that would be more conventional weapons would make it virtually impossible for us to effectively intercept or neutralize or destroy. So there is reason for concern, George. I wish I could say something more reassuring to the British people. But to understand that to this stage there have been no Russian attacks on any sovereign territory inside NATO's boundaries. And I think that Mr. Putin is patient enough, and he thinks again, as we should strategically. And he says to himself, why should I attack anybody in NATO when they are busy destroying themselves? I don't have to. Eventually, when the smoke clears, we'll be able to negotiate peacefully with them. There's no need for me to do anything. There's only one location where he will attack, and that's in theater. I can make you this guarantee, George. If anything in Britain facilitates directly a strike on Russian territory, you can anticipate Russian strikes on those installations. Without a shadow of a doubt, he is going to do that. He is absolutely dedicated to that. He's made that evident, but he's not going to attack. He'd have to be a fool to do it. He'd have to have a death wish. Why on earth would you assume the enormous obligation for feeding tens of millions of people when they're starving themselves to death in Western Europe? It makes no sense. And he's also witnessed this happen before. He's a student of history. He's read about it, and he lived through a lot of it. In 1991, why did the USSR collapse? It collapsed because it could not maintain itself economically and compete with us. And it refused to come to grips with internal challenges in the country. Well, what do you see in Western Europe? You see precisely the same thing. You've destroyed your economy yourselves. You're destroying your society. Everything's corrupt in Brussels. People in Britain know now that they don't control anything that happens to them. The Germans have discovered that. You're bankrupt. You can't fight anybody. Your militaries are a shadow of their former selves, and people will not tolerate any mobilization for these wars. No one voted for them in Germany. No one voted for them in Britain. No one voted for extending the war in Ukraine. And no one is interested in fighting Israel's war of conquest in the Middle East. That's all nonsense. So where is the disconnect? The disconnect is back to where we started. Money. Everything's about money and power. Money breeds power and influence. He's made commitments to get where he is. He's attempting to deliver, and it's catastrophic for him. He needs to stand up and say, I'm the president of the United States. I have responsibilities to the American people. This is what I promised. I've got to deliver. Well, that would require him to abandon his overseas commitments completely. He would be compelled to sign off on the optimal deal that he could secure for the Ukrainians. He would be compelled to tell Mr. Netanyahu, I can't support your genocidal actions in Gaza or the West Bank or anywhere else. And by the way, whatever is problematic in Venezuela, I'm perfectly willing to negotiate with Maduro. Maduro has offered us a stake in his oil and gas industries, and I'm going to accept it. That's what he would do. He's obviously not a free agent. It doesn't, and that's my bottom line. I think the truth is as following. When this is over, you will have either Palestine or Israel, but you won't have both. And I've spent time in Israel. I actually appreciate the Israelis personally. I thought very highly of their senior military leaders, but they've made it very clear that the only outcome that is acceptable to them is for Israel to grow larger and stronger at the expense of the Palestinians, their homes, and their position inside Israel. They have reasons that are demographic and reasons of strategy. The Israeli state believes that they are most secure when the rest of the region is balkanized, when it is divided and people are killing each other. They prefer that because they translate that into security for Israel. I see no evidence for that mentality changing. I think people have to understand that I think still, even at this stage, at least 80% of the Israeli population supports that. They may not appreciate Mr. Netanyahu. I don't know of anybody who does, but that doesn't make any difference. He's viewed as a man of intelligence, as a man who is ruthless enough to make all of this happen. And we are regarded as the subordinate vassal of Greater Israel, and they expect us to support them regardless of whatever they do. Thus far, that's exactly what we've done. Worshipping at the altar of Israel is financially very profitable, George. I can't emphasize that enough. When we discuss about these wars, you have on the one hand this sort of money laundering scheme that Tucker Carlson rightly described, but you have to examine the bank accounts. There are some investigations underway of senior senators who've received millions of dollars as a result of this, what we call laundering operation. But it's more than that. If you're a senior officer in the military and you're a strident advocate for Israel in whatever it desires, which amounts to perpetual conflict with its neighbors in the region to establish their hegemony, when you retire, you are rewarded by membership in financial firms in New York City, by joining boards of directors and banks, by being appointed officers in the defense industries, by being enshrined as a notable personality or expert in one of the so-called think tanks in Washington. And all the think tanks are owned by the same people. They're not think tanks, they're advocacy tanks. But the point is that everyone has figured out if you want to get wealthy and you want to be rewarded, be on the right side. And so that's why there is no shortage of people willing to step forward and do this. The danger for someone like President Trump is that there is an inexhaustible supply of sycophantic generals who will tell him whatever he wants to hear because it's financially rewarding to do so. The problem is at some point it's going to become militarily catastrophic and strategically disastrous for us. When that happens is anybody's guess, but I think we're closer to it now, as you mentioned at the outset, than perhaps we have been in decades. That's not accurate, George. You know, there was a Macgregor involved with Simon Bolivar. He was kind of a rogue, but he had quite a reputation. He fought the revolution. There's no justification, George. There's no justification for a war with Venezuela. This is nonsense. There's no reason to invade that place. And if we go into it and we're brutal and we kill people and we do damage, Venezuela is going to become the rallying point for millions of people all over Latin America who despise us already. We'll see 100,000 paramilitaries from Brazil and Colombia pour into the place. It'll be a never-ending disaster. It'll go on forever. You know, the major problem we have is the same one. Back in 1964, I think it was late 64, early 65, the Secretary of Defense McNamara called the Supreme Commander of NATO, an Army 4-star, and he asked him, "General, how long do you think it'll take us to get the 101st Airborne Division into Vietnam?" He said, "Oh, I don't think it'll take very long to get them in. The question is, how long will it take us to get them the hell out?" Well, of course, Secretary McNamara didn't like that answer and said thank you and hung up the phone. That's our problem. No one ever asked the question, okay, why are we going in? And then saying, well, that this is the mission. Can you explain the mission? How are we going to do it? What's it going to look like when we complete it? There's no emphasis on that. The emphasis is just get everyone in, push everybody in. We'll figure it out once we're on the ground. It's a catastrophe. It doesn't work. Well, they've lost their minds. I tried to explain that the Russians initially, when they went in, had these orders, which I'm sure many Russian generals were uncomfortable with. That said, don't shoot anyone. Literally, we don't want to shoot anybody. We want these Ukrainians to understand that we're there to protect the Russians, but we're not necessarily their enemy. So minimize, damage, not just collateral damage. We don't want to kill the Ukrainians. And of course, Russian generals had stated, let's get them all in their barracks before they deploy. They're sitting in their barracks right now. Let's hit them all. No, said Putin. No. I don't want to do that. I don't want to kill these people unnecessarily. Well, he truly believed these were Slavic Orthodox Christians and that something could be worked out. And as soon as they understood what was happening, that things would change. So I think it was pretty clear to me by April, after I examined it, what happened in February and March. The Russians were not yet up to standard there. There's no question about that. But the Russians also went in with a very small force. Even though they had a very small force, they were facing a very large force, Larry. You know, you had over 400,000 in the regular army, Ukrainian army. You had another 480,000 or so in reserves, and they were all in the field. And yet this small Russian force continued to make progress. And I said, well, there's something radically wrong. Ukrainians aren't that capable. But it wasn't until later I realized it wasn't so much the fault of the Ukrainian soldier, it was us. It was the U.S. Army again, along with their colleagues in the British Army who were giving them terrible advice, tactically catastrophic. All the generals that you have operating around now, like this man Donahue, the four-star in Europe, the man who was a co-architect of the disaster in Afghanistan, the withdrawal. I mean, these people were giving everybody terrible advice. What's his name? What was his name? Cavoli or something? Cavoli, yes. It's hard to keep up with all the guys. They all seem to have emerged suddenly under Odierno, who I think decided he wanted to promote other people with vowels on the ends of their names. Anyway, they were giving these people terrible advice. In the meantime, the Russians were getting progressively better and better and better. And also, I saw democracy in action for the first time in Russia. Now, let me explain this. I'm not a big advocate for liberal democracy, don't get me wrong, but there was an operation in the south down near Kherson, and this Russian brigade committed a couple of battalions of airborne troops to this operation. It didn't work well. Now, their losses were not catastrophic, but they lost a lot of people, had a lot of people wounded. And these people wrote a letter to Putin, which was also passed to the newspapers, and said this commander is an idiot. He did not do his job. He did not take the precautions that were required. We were not adequately prepared. We had not established the connectivity that we have to have of all the strike units, rocket artillery, artillery in general, and so forth, so on. Well, that man was removed, and I was talking to another friend who said that's democracy in action. Putin listened, and people began to pay attention to what people on the battlefield were saying. Very positive thing. That never happens in the U.S. military. We do the opposite. We try to conceal and cover up, gross incompetence. But I was very impressed with that. I think from that point forward in the summer of 2022, once you get sort of Surovikin who comes in there and he makes the argument for strategic elasticity, let's back off, create the right kind of defense in depth with the strike capabilities, with the ISR, strike connectivity and operation, all of that, then suddenly the Russian army begins to sort of take off and becomes this almost invincible force. But what they did was essentially, and the Russians will never say this, but it's what the Germans did to the Russians in World War I. If you go back and examine the German advance, the limit of advance for the German forces, the Germans in the First World War, were not stupid. They said, first of all, what are we marching into Russia for? There's nothing there but Russians, Yeah, be going there for. So they had Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Courland, the Baltic states, most of Poland, all the way down to Galicia, and that's it. They stopped. And the Russians did then what the Ukrainians have done subsequently in Ukraine in this war. They relentlessly assaulted the German defense in depth, and they were absolutely annihilated through what? Mass artillery fire. And that was sort of, in my judgment, really great achievement. So from the time you build this elastic defense that is absolutely, for all intents and purposes, practically impenetrable, when you move from that forward, the Russian army is on the path to victory. There's no question about it. We never come to terms with it. Nobody examines her. I mean, now this is Dave Petraeus say, well, now they're really good at combined arms warfare. This guy's stuck in 1942. What the hell are you talking about? This is not combined arms warfare. It's a totally different brand, a new paradigm. Well, and I think they're going to perform very well. And now they're getting the new equipment, and that M1A1 tank, which I served with and utilized, it had one huge dramatic problem, the freaking engine. Yeah, it's a catastrophe. We knew in 1990 that you could track wherever an army formation went that had M1 series tanks in it from low Earth orbiting satellites. They could track the thermal signature because the damn thing was burning at thousands of degrees Fahrenheit. And then, of course, without much effort at all, there were something like 42 connections in and around the engine that had all these small tubes of various alloys that carried fluid, and all you had to do was shake one of those loose. The fluid hits the engine, you got a giant fire, and your engine is essentially dead meat. You had to get a new engine. And so after the war was over, all of us, I'm talking about at least in my part of the battlefield, we first said, we got to get rid of these engines. These are a catastrophe. They're a logistical nightmare because you're consuming too much fuel too frequently. And we explained how, you can't come forward and refuel on the battlefield because if you refuel right next to the tanks are up online, everything's going to go wrong, a terrible explosion and so forth. So we were taking tanks offline, would go back, refuel and come up, but it was always hazardous. It was always a disaster and we had to refuel too much. And one of the things that I did during that war with my unit, so I said, if we stop, and we were stopped all the time relentlessly during the so-called offensive. Well, why? And it stopped because of the generals wanted to make certain that the lines were straight and the flanks were protected and nobody moved. And so every day, you would go a couple of hours, stop, then you would sit for 2 or 3 hours and then move and then stop again after an hour of movement and wait and on and on. I mean, we sat there and watched most of the Republican Guard Corps escape on the 25th of March, February. That my point is that we said, look, you got to eliminate this. And I said, when we stop, let's refuel. And I said, you stay online. We're going to do a leapfrog operation. We're going to take the vehicles offline. They're going to refuel. They'll come back online. And then we'll do the same thing with the rest of the company, and we'll go on until we're at that point where we don't need to refuel. But we wasted hours of operational time during that operation. And the same sort of thing should have happened inside Russia with the Germans in World War II if we had not had Hitler. Hitler wanted to demonstrate, that he could conquer large tracts of territory. He understood Soviet communism, which is very small consolation, but he didn't understand what their armed forces were like, what Russian people were like, what the economy could accomplish in the hands of a ruthless dictator like Stalin. He just didn't understand Russia. And you have that challenge here to a large extent. There's a lot of fear, prejudice, hatred, whatever you want to call it, directed against Russia, and no education, no knowledge, and certainly no understanding of Russian culture and history and the Russian people themselves. And I think it's profoundly dangerous. And I think we've reached the point now where Moscow, having suffered through so many Western attacks, invasions, and so forth, there's now a strategic logic to ending the threat from the West. By the way, the logic is not to conquer and occupy everything up to the Portuguese coastline. Fundamentally, the question is, how do I make it impossible for the West to launch another attack? And I think you also have a sort of a fatigue in Russia with the West. We've done everything to demonstrate good faith and establish relationships, and nobody's interested, so forget it. What I worry about is the unwillingness of our leaders, all of these political leaders that are elevated to these positions in Washington for reasons that are not clear, but they don't seem to have any intelligence, don't seem to have any education, don't seem to have good judgment, common sense, experience, all of them deficient. I don't know, you take your pick. Most seem to have all of these liabilities, right? And they are unable or unwilling to acknowledge that any action on their part could result in a nuclear war. And that's a very profound problem, Larry, because I think for now that these strikes with ATACMS and with missiles from the UK have not worked out terribly well.